Hi, great to have you on the show, Jeff.
Nice to be with you.
So many of your readers and our Real Money Show listeners know that you were born in Canada, in fact, and had some tremendous corporate and investment success here. Now, today there are a lot of top-of-mind issues affecting us Canadians today. We are hearing things about, or we're seeing things like the spiraling loonie. And there's a lot of talk about negative interest rates by the Bank of Canada, although they kind of paused and they put the pause button on yesterday, kind of helping the boost of the loonie today. And as well, some rather negative investor sentiment here in Canada in the equity markets and some real estate markets at this time. So with all these issues in mind, what are your thoughts or insights right now on these topics, Jeff?
Well, essentially, this is something that's been in the works for a long time. What's going on right now with the Canadian dollar falling dramatically, the Canadian stock market's coming off dramatically. I've been predicting all of this happening. I predicted this was going to happen over the last few years, and definitely last year I said that this was all going to start happening in the fall of 2015, and it has. And I said 2016 is going to be a bloodbath, and already in the first 3 weeks of 2016 it already has. But this is actually just the beginning. People listening to this program should be really listening to what I have to say. This is the beginning. This looks exactly like 2007, 2008, right. Which a lot of people might remember, but this is going to be far worse. There was the chief economist of the Bank of International Settlements, which is a financial terrorism organization, just said in Davos, another terrorist organization group meeting, that he was saying in Davos that sorry, I forgot exactly what he said about, he said this is exactly like 2007, 2008, but it's going to be much worse. So he said the exact same thing that we've been saying for a few years. So really this has started in 1971, essentially, when Nixon took the gold backing away from the U.S. dollar and put the entire world monetary system on a fiat government system. That combined with all these socialist democratic nation states around the world now have gone into massive amounts of debt. In 2008, it almost all collapsed, and the reason it didn't collapse is because they just printed a lot of money afterwards to make it look like it was still alive. Even George Soros said that the financial system collapsed in 2008, but then they just printed, and that's what we've seen with quantitative easing 1, 2, and 3, and governments around the world and central banks around the world printing a ton of money. So if you look at the charts of the Canadian dollar, for example, 2007, it was at a high of in September 2007 of about a little over par with the U.S. dollar. Right. By 2009, early in 2009, February, it was down to 78 cents. So that was an indicator of what was going on at that time. What's been happening is we've been actually going through a slower scale decline this time. It's actually lasted longer. It wasn't as abrupt as 2008. So this has actually started in 2011 for the loonie when it was up over $1.05 US, and now of course is under 70 cents US. This is just an indicator that we're nearing a complete financial crisis and catastrophe, like in 2007, 2008, and like William White of the Bank of International Settlements said, and we agree with them, this is going to be far worse. This could be absolutely catastrophic.
Absolutely. And many of your readers know that you have been making this call. Like myself, I'm a huge fan and a huge reader of your blog, found on dollarvigilante.com. The TDV reports are amazing. And in the past month and a half, I've been following your discussions on dollarvigilante.com, and you discussed two phenomena more recently at length. And one many of our listeners have heard about this, more so called the 7-year cycle. So this Shemitah trend or cycle. And the other is called this jubilee and the jubilee trend. Your posts on each of these have revealed some very strong patterns for this year 2016, including quite literally what we're seeing right now at the beginning of and a culmination of a world market meltdown. Jeff, could you take a few minutes to kind of elaborate on these two items for us and how they relate to both allocating some wealth to gold and silver?
Sure. I started the Dollar Vigilante in 2010 after I saw the 2008 crisis and near collapse. because around 2004, 2005, I saw that coming and I was watching. And when that happened, I knew what was going on in this financial and economic system. And I decided that after 2008, that the next crash, the next crisis would be probably the last one. And it probably wouldn't be too far out. I actually said in 2010, when I started the Dollar Vigilante, that I expect within 5 to 10 years, all fiat currencies, that includes the US dollar, the Canadian loonie, everything else, will go to zero. And so we just entered into that period where I said it could happen last year, which was quite interesting, 2015, which was quite a chaotic year. And it was in early 2015 I started to really discover a lot of timetables that are used by the financial elites, and it's actually fairly well known on Wall Street as a 7-year cycle. But thanks to Jonathan Cahn and his book, The Harbinger, I became aware of something called the Shemitah, which is an old Jewish occult sort of thing that these financial elites adhere to, a timetable. So there's actual exact times that they cause and do these crashes and collapses. And so it was in July of last year, 2015, I said by the fall there's going to be the beginning of a major crisis collapse. And we saw that in August with the Dow Jones down more than 1,000 points intraday. We saw the world markets going down dramatically. The third quarter was just atrocious around the world. It rebounded a bit since then, and I began talking about how the year after this Shemitah, which is started in September of 2015 and ends in October of 2016, is something called the Jubilee, and it's known as it comes after every 7 Shemitahs. This is very complex stuff. Right. I can't possibly explain it all in a few minutes. But after there's a lot of numerology involved in this. And so after every 7 years is a Shemitah, and after every 7th Shemitah, which is every 49 years, is something called the Jubilee. And there's a lot of stuff in the Jewish Torah and things like that about how this is a time that you wash away debts and things like that. And it was actually William White who at Davos just a few days ago said this is a debt jubilee. And so that confirmed that I've caught on to what's going on. And he warned very dramatically that this is a serious biblical level event that is right in front of us, if not in the next few months, definitely in the next year. Mm-hmm. And so I've been following that for a while, and I said that 2016 was going to be an absolute bloodbath, and already, as I pointed out, only 3 weeks in, we've already seen the U.S. markets down 10%, we've seen China down 20%, Saudi Arabian markets down 33%, just seeing astronomical numbers for just a few weeks, and a lot of panic starting to set in. I think it might subside a little bit for a couple of weeks, maybe even a month now, but then it's going to get even much worse, so people should definitely be preparing for what happened in 2008, but much worse. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And on the Real Money Show, like yourself, you focus on internationalizing your assets and creating a private reserve. So here on the Real Money Show, we discuss the idea on a weekly basis that both gold and silver can act as wealth preservers and have a track record of doing this dating back some 4,000 to 5,000 years. In the next 4 to 5 years, Jeff, what do you foresee the gold and silver markets being capable of, considering these cycles and the indicators? Do you see gold and silver being that wealth preserver and potentially moneymaker?
I look at it much more as a wealth preserver, but definitely if you can preserve your wealth during the next year and definitely over the next few years, you will be much wealthier than most people you know who have their money in bank accounts in fiat currencies like the Canadian or US dollars. They're going to just get annihilated over the next few years. As I said, I expect complete collapse of these currencies. Right. So it's not so much about making money, although if you do put all of your assets into precious metals, you will be so much more wealthier than anyone you know in 5 years. But it's not really about that. Richard Russell, who wrote the Dow Theory letters, who just died a few months ago, he's one of the most well-known newsletter writers ever. He essentially started the financial newsletter business, and he was, I think, in his 80s or 90s when he just recently died. But he said just last year that the person who loses the least in this coming crisis is going to win. So it's really more about preservation of wealth and keeping what you have than trying to make a lot of money at this moment in time.
Absolutely. I love the fact that you bring up the depreciating currencies, because this is one of my focuses, and I love Dry is to combat that by allocating some of the wealth in gold and silver. So it's a great point there, Jeff. Thank you so much. Now, you had a post this morning. In fact, I looked at it. It was a chart on your blog showing the iShares MSCI index, which is the worldwide stock markets index. And yes, in fact, since the beginning of the Shemitah year to now, the world markets are down over 20%. And we're seeing various indicators like the dollar index, these indices. Many people want to see the charts, so you show them the charts. But there is an index, and in relation to all of this, we recall recently reading also that you have a billionaire colleague in the shipping industry who's talking about what is happening right now, and the fact that they had no ships at sea. So we delved into the index, the Baltic Dry Index, and we witnessed some disturbing trends. And when we see what the Baltic Dry Index has done over the past year also. Now, for many people who don't know, the Baltic Dry Index, in essence, just measures how much it costs to ship dry commodities around the world. And there is stagnation. Huge indicator. It's also called the canary down the coal mine. It's predicting, it's flashing red right now. Now, with these warning signs being flashed like this, can you project where the world economy will or might be in 3 to 5 years' time, Jeff?
In 3 to 5 years, absolutely impossible. What we're going to go through over the next year or two, at most two, is going to shock the world. We've never, as humanity, seen anything like this, with a complete global fiat currency system. So everyone's using fiat currencies around the world, and they're all going to collapse. We've never seen that. We've seen fiat currencies collapse hundreds of times over the course of human history. Just recent ones include Zimbabwe, Argentina, of course, in the 20th century, Germany, the Weimar Republic. Countless fiat currencies have collapsed, but those were just one area or one country that had a collapse. So we've never had the entire world, which is now every single currency is backed by the U.S. dollar. That includes the Canadian dollar. And most Canadians don't know this because they won't teach you in your public indoctrination camps, or as they call them, government schools, about how the money system works and what backs the Canadian dollar. But the only thing backing the Canadian dollar at the Bank of Canada are U.S. dollar reserves. So when the U.S. dollar collapses, the Canadian dollar will collapse along with it. Most Canadians are completely unaware that all the gold of the Canadian government and the Bank of Canada was all sold in the 80s and 90s. There was very little reported about that in the mainstream, from the mainstream prostitutes, but there's absolutely nothing backing that currency. So all these currencies are going to be washed away in the coming years. It might not be this year, but it's going to be soon enough that you should be prepared for it. You pointed out the Baltic Shipping Index. That's just one of literally dozens and dozens of indicators that are showing that worldwide trade is coming to a screeching halt. We've seen the Baltic Dry Index is at all-time lows. Almost every day it hits an all-time low now. This is something that people should be paying attention to. This should be what's on CNBC or what's on the Canadian Business Channel. But of course, they just have their puppets up there trying to keep everyone in the markets, trying to keep everyone from panicking, just like Jim Cramer of CNBC when he told people not to panic, not to sell Bear Stearns in 2007. He said, you'd be crazy, you'd be silly to sell Bear Stearns. It was at $82 a share when he said that. 6 days later, it was sold to JP Morgan for $2 a share. This is what they do. Turn off the television. It's called programming for a reason. You just have to look at everything. The price of oil is obviously showing a massive strain, something absolutely insane happening in the markets. That also happened right before the crisis in 2008. Mm-hmm. You look at the price of copper, also known as Dr. Copper, because it kind of shows how the economy is doing at very big lows as well. Every major indicator is showing that things are looking very bad. And unlike past times in history, history. When central banks have hit these recessions or depressions, the central banks have absolutely no ammunition now. They can't lower interest rates. They're all at 0% or negative, which is absolutely insane. Keynesian Kool-Aid drinking, central banking, communist socialism style capitalism, as they call it, which it absolutely isn't. This is insanity. People are going to look back at this period in time and be shocked they didn't know how bad this crisis was going to be before it happened.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Last question, Jeff, if you could just really briefly touch upon this. We have a listener question from a friend of ours, Mike V. of Oakville, and was bringing this up to me in reference to the mainstream news. Why isn't this information on the mainstream, the BNNs and the CNNs of the world? And he's been a follower of your blogs and your analysis for a while, who kindly asked me to relay this question to you. Mike asks, Jeff, being very knowledgeable of Mexican and Central American, South American economies and international policies in that region, being internationalizing your assets and investments, why do you believe Puerto Rico, a colony of the USA, after defaulting back in early January, did not get much media attention? And why did the reality of this Greek-like event not impact the U.S. dollar strength? Can you take a minute to briefly touch upon that?
Well, I think there's numerous factors involved. Of course, what the media covers or doesn't cover has no bearing on its importance. They did cover to some extent Greece a little bit just because there was a lot of riots and stuff, but they barely covered that the banks were closed there for months last year during their crisis, which is still ongoing and will continue to ongo and will hit all of Europe and will hit the U.S. and Canada and Australia. Europe just put in bank bailing clauses on January 1st of this year. That should tell people something. That's what Cyprus did in 2013 when they closed all their banks overnight and stole 50% of all the depositors' money from their bank accounts because the banks were they were insolvent. That was called a bank bail-in. So essentially now, in the old days, you used to rob banks. Now the banks rob you. And that is going to happen all throughout Europe. It's going to happen all across the Western world. So they didn't really cover that. And they didn't cover the fact that Bitcoin went from $35 to about $350 during that time period. Of course, they don't tell you about these things or precious metals or anything like that. They want you to think that's a barbaric relic while we continue to use pieces of paper with dead criminals printed on them as money that is backed by nothing, which is complete insanity, of course. So as far as Puerto Rico, I don't know why the media did or didn't cover it to a certain extent, but I think it's not a massive deal. I think everything else that's going on is just as big or bigger. Puerto Rico is not a huge place. I think it's I'm not sure. I don't know every country's GDP or anything, but I think it was around the same size as possibly. I don't think it was as big as Greece, for example. I don't think that necessarily should have affected the U.S. dollar too much. That's the amount of debt they had, I doubt, is anywhere near the U.S. federal government debt of $19 trillion. When that defaults, that's when the real fireworks go off. And it's, of course, totally unpayable. $19 trillion if interest rates were to rise to 10%, which is not a massive amount. It sounds massive today when they have 0% or negative interest rates, but 10% is a fairly standard long-term interest rate. If it were to rise to that level, that'd be $2 trillion per year the U.S. government would have to pay in interest payments alone, which is almost the entire tax base of the U.S. government. So every penny of tax would go just to pay interest on the debt if interest rates rose to 10%. So as far as Puerto Rico, I'm not sure why or why not that didn't get covered, but I don't think it was a massive deal. I think it was just one other thing that happened amongst many, many, many things that have happened in the last few years that is an indicator of what is coming.
Right. Absolutely. Jeff, Mr. Berwick, just want to thank you for joining us. That kind of wraps up our interview for today. We've definitely learned a lot. We're to continue to stay tuned to your blog and your newsletters. Just want to know if we can have you back sometime in the near future.
It'd be my pleasure.
And how do our listeners get in touch with you, Jeff?
If you're interested in this crazy talk I'm talking about that you never hear on your mainstream media television programming, just go to dollarvigilante.com, and we have a blog there. Just sign up for our email every day, and I put out information every day, as you pointed out, with information that you just don't get from the mainstream media, showing where this is headed. And if you don't start paying attention now, you are really being risky with your finances and your future.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.
You have all the major central banks, Japan, UK, Europe, America, all printing staggering amounts of money. The people who are getting that money, Jeff, are very happy, and their friends are very happy.
I believe in 2020 that we will be back into a rip-roaring, snorting bull market.
They may increase interest rates by 0.25% to kind of prove to the world how responsible they are.
Government is always mankind's biggest enemy throughout human history. It always has been. It's what destroyed Rome. It's what every empire has collapsed, and every war and all the billions of people have been killed. It's all due to government. So it is always our enemy.